Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here today, and glad to see we have lots of people on the call. I'm going to introduce Elaine Duncan to you guys. We are pleased to have her. We can't think of a more qualified person to talk to the group today. Before I do that, I'm just going to go over the agenda. So we'll introduce Elaine. She'll give a presentation on, as Jackie mentioned, the ABCs of medical device development. And then we'll have a Q&A and fireside chat with Eric Hartman, our Director of Commercialization here. Before I jump into the introduction, I want to tell you a little bit about our team. We have a full suite of commercialization managers here to help with the advancement of medical devices into the market. In addition to Eric, we have Kendra Stencil. She specializes in medical devices, diagnostics, and healthcare IT. We have Holly Clark, whose special area is therapeutics. Myself, I cover engineering, so some of the biomedical engineering inventions, and we are hiring someone, so in the materials energy sector. With that, I want to tell you, Elaine has an extensive background, and her bio covers all of that in detail, but at a very high level, she is the founder and president of Paladin Medical Incorporated. She's a certified regulatory affairs professional. She has a master's degree in mechanical and biomedical engineering, and she's an adjunct professor of biomedical engineering in the UK Halcombe Department of Biomedical Engineering. She has an extensive array of awards, but some of them include that she is in the UK Pigman College of Engineering Hall of Distinction and on the Dean's Advisory Committee. Prior to forming Paladin Medical in 1987, she held key executive positions in startup medical companies. And some of these positions included Vice President of New Ventures, Vice President of Research and Development, Vice President and Director of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance. Her Fortune 500 company experience in acquisition and technology assessment gives Elaine a unique understanding of the due diligence required for mergers and acquisitions within the medical industry. She has a broad experience in areas including artificial hearts, vascular grafts, spinal implants, and various disposable sterile products. Through Paladin Medical, Elaine serves clients around the world and has hundreds of regulatory submissions to her credit. So with that, I want to turn it over to her so she can get into the meat of the presentation and tell you how it's done with the ABCs. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Is everything working okay before I start? Okay?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Good. When Liz asked me to develop a presentation around the ABCs of medical device development, the word risk came to mind. And so I will be focusing on RISK and how it plays such a fundamental role in both the regulations of medical devices, but also how you can move through your product development, keeping an eye on risk. Okay. I organized this slide to help you see how the FDA regulations and your documentation requirements assuage the issue of risk. When we look at FDA's classification hierarchy, we see that they, in 1976, attempted to classify by way of identifying the relative risks of the product. The risk mitigation activity was reflected in the determination of what products might need pre-market assessment and labeling control as an example. Risk management by FDA is incorporated into the quality compliance and reporting adverse events and recall. Also, the device regulatory hierarchy reflects FDA's perspective of risk. One of the first things we want to do is make sure we're dealing with a medical device. Sometimes your product might not even be considered a medical device, although that's getting less and less likely. But also it might be a combination product. It might be a drug. So one of the first things we try to do, take the definition of medical device that FDA has put forth and make certain that we are dealing with a medical device But if we are working with a combination product, we need to also recognize that and take mindfulness of their guidance documents and other aspects of the combination products, which could actually mean you would have more than one submission. But I've been working a lot with Class 1 medical products, which are exempt from 510K. And one of the interesting aspects I find of that is that we tend to be taking new technologies and applying them to Class 1 devices. And that can actually cause a product to be not exempt. But also when FDA went through and exempted all Class 1 devices, they did make some exceptions. Class 2 devices are the ones we typically think of that would need a 510K, but in the last few years, even some of the Class 2 devices have been exempted from needing a 510K application. And then there's your standard Class 2 devices where there's a moderate risk and FDA wants to oversee the pre-market application of the products that are Class 2. And that's the vast majority of the regulatory applications to FDA. Not too many years ago, they came along with a category called de novo. This category is devices, as you can imagine, means of new, and they may be devices that are Class 2 nominally, but either new technology or new uses would cause them to not have a good foundation and a predicate product. So if you can't establish substantial equivalence to another Class 2 product, you might find yourself with a de novo application. Class 3 products, of course, are the higher risk levels. These are typical PMA products. We think naturally of implantable products, life support, and life-sustaining products. Now, there are a few other product categories. I do get involved occasionally with an HUD. These type products might not actually be fully characterized in either of the classifications, but we think of those necessarily as possibly like a special product. Drugs often think in terms of special uses, orphan products, that sort of thing. There's also a few other new special categories. If you have a really, really special product, FDA might put you into that category. But it's seldom that your classifications don't still apply. But HUDs are those emergency type uses. So when I flagged exempt, I wanted to clarify that this is exempt from filing a 510K. FDA has revised some of the original requirements for certain devices based on the perception that general controls can manage risk. Now, FDA defines general controls, but in short, it means you do all of the other quality concerns, meeting the appropriate level of regulatory compliance with quality systems, monitoring your product in the field, and not breaking other rules, such as advertising outside of the rules for that particular product. Now, there is an exception to the exemption. And this is something we want to always look at if we think our product is exempt from filing a 510K. Things that might be cause for a submission to FDA would be perhaps a different technology and or a different intended use, which causes different risk. And these are typically the reasons why an exemption may not apply. One example of an intended use might be a device that's nominally used in the hospital, but now you want to take it into the home use. That might trigger a 510K. What we need to do when we're identifying a product as an exempt from filing is make sure we document our justification for why it is exempt. And I often step back and actually do a comparative analysis to an existing product or products that are on the market that also consider themselves exempt. So documentation of that initial decision is certainly important. And regardless of how you think your device is regulated, your company is required to register and list your product with the FDA, and that triggers the potential for an FDA inspection. Now, Class 1 and many Class 2 products are very low on the inspection list, but legally, when you register, you have an open door for FDA inspection. Your decision that your product is exempt can be challenged at any time by FDA, and if you start to make changes, even possibly minor ones, you could void the exemption. And advertising claims that you start to make on your product could also affect your classification or your exemption. So a good baseline documentation is your determination of the status of your product. Now, why would we and when would we consider design control and review? This is subject to audit of records after the device may be cleared by FDA and put on the market. So I like to assume you need to start design control and review, even if later found to be an exempt device, because many exempt devices still require a full quality system regulatory compliant. For example, to exempt device still requires all elements of the quality system regs, including design control. Now also, ISO 13485, which is more or less the quality standard for the rest of the world, does not have an exemption from design control, regardless of the classification. So as early as you can decide that you have things to document, particularly decisions, it's good to establish your design control and review procedures. And failure to conduct a design control and review portion of your quality system can't be recreated retrospectively. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. Design control begins at project planning, and I believe you need to document your transition from feasibility to development. So maybe you've been working on research, feasibility, defining what your product goals might be, but now you've decided to start doing testing. I especially think that once you start to step outside your own lab or your own building, you should be under design control. FDA can audit the design control records years after the product is on the market and even issue a warning letter or cause a consent decree if they determine that you failed to properly manage your design and development. After you've started to decide you're leaving feasibility and going into development, input requirements become your best friend. And documenting those input requirements as early as possible is extremely useful. Now, when we talk about input requirements, we're really talking about kind of two kinds of requirements. The first one we really need to understand is the user need. User needs are often referred to as the voice of the customer. And I believe when you start to recognize the unmet user needs, that's why there's a gold star there, we start to see why a product can be popular in the marketplace and take off with investors because there is a recognized demand for the product. But user needs can be very mixed, and it's often useful to document a user survey, certainly literature searches, and define the current evolving technology. Now you could start to see that that becomes a documentation of similarities and differences and possibly substantial equivalence to an existing product. But a survey, however you may do it, or looking at someone else's surveys, documenting at the time of transition from feasibility to development and knowing what the voice of the customer was at that time is very important. That also helps you define the gaps in the existing technologies that may be opportunities for you. What FDA or, in fact, European standards and guidances may exist that constrain that product currently. Those constitute input requirements as well, and they're more on the line of engineering requirements, such as electrical standards or biocompatibility standards. So if we say at a user need level that it has to be biocompatible, we may have standards that help us define that from engineering terms. Also, we need to understand what performance standards are considered de rigueur, in other words, minimum requirements that we would have to meet. One of the best ways to start to find that, once you think you have the classification pro code of your product, you can even go to FDA's website and punch in that pro code or even the product description keywords and identify what standards FDA recognizes about your product. And doing this early now is important for a number of reasons. Some international standards are revised every 5 years. And a lot of the times, revision to make sure they're current. And so we find particularly some of the ISO standards get revised on what I would consider nuance, better writing, or other standards have come along to influence them and they want to incorporate that. Also, totally new standards are developed constantly as technology evolves. Software is a very good example of that. And FDA guidance documents can be revised with very little notice, no notice even, and they may alter the requirements that could affect your development costs and pathway. Documenting the baseline of these inputs is critical to design management and risk assessment as the product is under development. But I also want to bring you to a relatively current problem in the field that developed around CPAP devices. Now, CPAPs are a palliative measure to help with sleep apnea and other sleep problems. But those problems are typically not life-threatening. And yet, a bad CPAP filter has been known to be the source of death. And so, as these products that have been on the market for many years encounter these field problems, we find that these companies making the devices are having to go back, re-specify the materials in their filters, retest those filters for longevity, and alert the users to problems with these CPAP filters, and possibly even change the instructions for use for how these devices are cleaned between uses or repurposed for other users. This has been a very eye-opening situation in the medical device field because, again, a CPAP was supposed to make you feel better, not cause your death. Let's go back to our favorite word, risk. Now, risk comes along in many applications in development. One of the first things we want to do is a design risk analysis. And typically, we are going to start with our design inputs. But another level of device risk analysis can be necessary when we start to pull other elements into the device itself. That could be apps that we might even purchase or connect with a cell phone. It could be an accessory. So once we have a better picture of what the actual final device to the marketplace looks like, we might need to have yet another level of device risk analysis. Process risk analysis will certainly take your manufacturing and materials processing levels and analyze if some alteration in the process were to occur, what type of risk could occur to the product performance. We also look at user level risk analysis, and this is often required when we're looking at products that are used by the patient themselves, and we want to make sure that our instructions for use and the environment where the user may be using the product are suitable. Excuse my phone there. Now, risk mitigation is actually ongoing, and we identify the hazards which can be mitigated. So when we use the word risk, we're really looking at a hazard and the potential for that hazard to occur to define the level of risk. Now, risk management, another word we hear a lot, is usually associated with life cycle management. This is much more prevalent in EU regulatory, but FDA has been doing it for years and is systematically conducted by way of compliance with complaint management, adverse event reports, and recalls. And so the total cycle risk, life cycle risk management is a part of the quality systems and should be a part of how your product is serviced in the marketplace. Now, the ISO standard 14971 has become essentially the go-to standard for risk management and the authority of how well you have done your risk management and when to apply it. Now, this is a snapshot off of the FDA website, and I typed in the word risk, and this is the row that came up that says FDA recognizes these two standards and gives you a risk recognition number, 5125. And so when you're making your application, you want to be able to say to FDA, I did my risk management according to these standards. And you keep an eye on the idea of whether or not that standard has been reissued or not. One of the things I'm finding with working with some of the clients in Europe is they work with the ISO standards as they may be modified, and FDA is a little slower to pick up every different modification to every different standard, which is good for us because it may take a year or more to transition to another level of a standard. That's why I really believe you need to establish procedures. And in development projects that aren't part of a company, you may find this a little awkward, especially if a lot of people on your team are volunteers. But each development project should be able to look at a procedure for conducting risk analysis and risk management. And so you really need to have a written procedure on how you implement the ISO 14971 and train people who are involved in doing the risk analysis. We want to have a clear understanding of the scope of the analysis. For example, we may have a whole line of products coming along, but the first one we want to take to market might be the scope of the existing documentation. So we define what is subject to the risk analysis. That can include, for example, if it's a different intended user, but the same indication for use. We want to document how we develop our analysis, how to modify the risk analysis as new information is developed. And this can be very important for a long-term type project. And of course, our ultimate goal is to establish a traceability matrix that tracks our risks from our initial analysis all the way through to the deliverables for a submission. Now I'm showing you here kind of a simplified initial level hazard analysis and assessment. You see, this is on the model of an FMEA, failure modes and effects analysis. So we have a requirement of waterproof as an example. And if it wasn't waterproof, an electrical device might cause a shock. And we might say, well, that could happen if the insulation breaks down. So we're going to mitigate that by testing it according to a standard. It turns out there could be another cause, insulation breakdown, but what about that the material we specify wasn't proper in the first place? So we want to be really particular about some of these possible causes because the mitigations may be different. So in other words, for waterproof, I might have another role that would say my controller mitigation is to specify a certain type of waterproof around insulation around the wiring. Also, I might have to have a waterproof container and shock resistant, etc. So as you can see very quickly, some of the requirements for the product may have possible hazards associated with failing to meet those requirements, and our methods of mitigating those risks may vary based on potential cause of the hazard. Obviously, I don't expect you to review this table, but I wanted to show you how quickly a simple risk analysis will balloon into a hazard and traceability matrix. So one of the things we look for is how well has our mitigation step reduced the level of hazard. So in this example, the team has used red to illustrate that they believe their risk level is too high initially, but after they've conducted their mitigations, they have lowered the level of risk, illustrated by the yellow and green coloring for the scoring. And one of the other aspects of this risk analysis, or excuse me, this risk matrix, is we can use this matrix. On the right-hand side, you see the risk control verification. I don't know if you can see that, but this can be a list of the testing that we want to do to the standard and to make sure we have effectively completed that risk mitigation, which you see here in the status called done. So when we're finished with our project, we can see how we saw the potential hazards, how we saw that to be level of a harm, the severity of the harm, and the level of controls that we have put in place. Believe me, these types of matrix can go many pages. I did a 510K a month ago, and the matrix itself was 20 pages. Now, the risk mitigation activity will drive your verification and validation. Some people call this DVGT. We want to identify and prioritize which of the mitigations might be simple verifications or verification that we comply with a standard. We also want to identify which ones of those mitigations actually rise to the level of a validation. It's important to time these validations for your project because you may find either through verification or validation that you have to step back and redefine either the requirement or the mitigation itself. So changes to knowledge about the risks may compel revisions back to your inputs or your requirements, even the way you go about verifying the product. Changes to your intended use may alter the potential for a hazard, your ability to mitigate, and how you may validate. Now, this is an example of where we might find that we can't verify simply by standards, but we have to either validate through an animal study or through a clinical trial. So I think I've covered the topic, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was incredibly helpful. Lots of information to digest in those slides, and I'm sure we'll probably have a lot of questions. I'm going to turn it over to Eric to help lead us through this fireside chat.
All right. Elaine, could you stop sharing your screen when you get a second?
Oh, sorry. All right.
All right. So we are going to move into our question and answer section now. If you would, sorry, one second. All right, so we're going to move into our question and answer section here. So if you would put any questions that you have for Elaine in the chat, and we'd be happy to address those as we go through. We also do have a fireside chat planned with some different questions and examples that we may work through. but we want to begin with your question. So Elaine, one question that we had that we wanted to ask as other questions are starting to come in. You talked a little bit about 510K. Can you tell us what a 510K application is?
Oh, of course. One of the things we do in a 510K is to establish substantial equivalence to an existing product. Because these regulations were originally issued in 1976 and the classifications were established then, FDA allows us now to make our comparison to existing products that are also cleared. We don't have to go back to devices from 1976. But this requires us to look at similarities and differences, and those attributes of those products can sometimes be hard to identify, but we can also go to the FDA website, and hopefully the more current devices have an established summary of their safety and effectiveness. We also can go to the website and pull down what they have put on their websites. We can go to a physician perhaps and get a copy of the labeling, maybe even the box of the product, and start to establish what were the requirements fulfilled by the other product. And we're looking at their outputs, really, not their inputs, but we look at how they perform in the market. What kind of standards do they have to meet? What kind of claims do they meet? And in particular, their approved indication for use. Some of the older indication for use documents didn't also include intended user, but now we see that more often described as well. So we want to make sure we're like the other products. That doesn't mean we can't have innovations, but again, that's where the risk analysis comes in.
Excellent. So Jackie Wilmot has a question. Jackie, if you'd like to unmute, you can ask your question.
Sure. Thank you. It was a little too complicated to write in the chat. Elaine, thanks for your time today. It was really interesting. I have a question just about a specific scenario, and I'm just curious if you've dealt with these, and I just don't know the answer. So some devices are medical devices are intrusive and go into the body, like an ET tube, goes into the lungs, or a screw that goes into a bone, to secure a fracture. And then oftentimes those devices are securely held on the outside of the body. For the ET tube, it's something around the ET tube secured to the neck or face. And for the bone fracture, it's some sort of device that sits outside around the foot or the arm that holds the K-wire pins or that go into, the screw and all that. So I'm just curious around those outside devices that hold things in place that are internal. Do they rise to the level of the same scrutiny of the internal device? Or not? And it might just be case by case, but.
Well, certainly FDA in their definition of class and classifications have recognized that some implantable products are class 2. I recently worked on a new version of a Foley catheter, which is invasive, can stay in for 30 days. But its contact is primarily with mucosa. And so what we do is we definitely look at the prior art, see what you're changing about your device, if anything. And one of the primary issues would be the biocompatibility hierarchy that has been established around that type of device. Now, I'm
sorry to interrupt you, but I'm interested in the thing that sits outside the body, like for a K-wire that goes into a foot fracture, to hold it in place. Outside, orthopedic surgeons use like little devices to hold those K-wires steady, or like for the ET,
like a cage
outside. Yeah.
Yes.
So I wonder if those things that are outside the body stabilizing something that's inside the body, does that outside device rise to the same level of scrutiny as the internal device?
I'm sorry to say it may or may not. It's
I
going to depend.
would be the answer.
It's going to depend on what it's holding
Yeah.
and how it's classified by FDA. So obviously, some of the things you would want to be looking at is the cage can't wiggle, for example. You wouldn't want it to fall off.
Right.
And so robustness might be necessary, but also who's using it and when. So if it's a neurological cage for stereotactic work, it may have a higher risk level than a device that's wrapped around an orthopedic pin. So basically what we would do is go to the classifications and determine for that type of use, how is FDA regulating that product?
That's helpful. Thank you so much.
All right, so we do have a couple of other questions coming in. I encourage everybody to please put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll get to those. So one question, Elaine, you talked a lot about procedures. Some of these are commercially available procedures, and then maybe some other procedures are company-specific internal procedures, which may require a lot of work to develop. So do you have any resources or any suggestions for an early stage company that they're trying to get access to procedures? What's the best way for them to get up and running without having to start from scratch?
Well, one of the things I've noticed is most people on project teams have worked someplace else. And oftentimes they'll bring along their old procedures from their prior company. And we want to watch out for that because sometimes those procedures may have been for Medtronic or Boston Scientific, and they're really overwrought. And so one of the things some folks I know do is go on the internet and look for certain procedures that may be offered. There are a lot of companies that are offering these for sale. It's also important to realize paper procedures and electronic procedures can be very different. There's a rule called Part 11, and if you're doing all of your procedures and your documentation electronically, you may have to meet that rule. But otherwise, a lot of startup companies just start filling a notebook. We offer procedure templates for our clients, but there are a lot of companies out there that are offering that. What's important is to look at these draft procedures and see if they are fulfilling your need, because they may be overly prescriptive, they may be less than adequate. Usually a procedure should have a good work form to go with it if you're trying to document that you met that procedure.
Okay, we have another question. Seems that that this could be daunting or grow daunting very quickly in terms of the procedures, the risk assessments, hazard identifications, other things like that. So as you think about that and the complexity that's involved with these, can you comment on how FDA approaches what happens if a risk is missed, or what happens if we make our best judgment and it turns out to be wrong? How are these types of things handled, and any advice that you might have?
Well, again, one of my examples here has been the CPAP devices. They've been adopted so readily by physicians and prescribed. And one of the issues we face with that is, can the physician even know sometimes about the hazards that are in the field? And would they have not prescribed a certain device had they known? So one of the things that FDA does is they look at these hazards that occur later on that were missed potentially, and put out notification about recalls. And there are class 1 and class 2 recalls. The class 1 recalls are typically clean up your act kind of notifications. They say, you missed this and we want you to fix it. And you may have to fix it in product that you are developed, that are in production before you can sell again. But the class 1 recalls are going to compel you to pull everything off the field, out of the field, and make immediate remediation. And that's the only way we really have of fixing something that was a severe issue that made it to the patient. Otherwise, during an inspection or during a 510K, the FDA may bring it to your attention and require you to fix the problem. That's what we're dealing with now.
So just, I'll ask a corollary follow-up here. So let's think particularly about somebody who may be new in their career, say a graduate student, or somebody who may be listening in and thinking about, you know, being a first-time developer in this space. What advice might you have for being able to kind of see around corners and have experience maybe beyond their years as they're thinking about risk analysis?
I think I'm kind of a worrywart personally. So I have a tendency to really shake the tree when it comes to the requirements and how they've been fulfilled with the current products, so that we look especially at the changes and see if those differences might introduce new risk. Another thing we find is just good old-fashioned literature studies can be the best friend. And more so in the European marketplace, a thorough literature survey is a requirement. And this helps the new products to develop their requirement statements. Another thing is early portional evaluations. So if there's an element of your product that you might be able to test sooner rather than later, doing that in simulation can be very important. I know that, for example, software is a good example of where we might start to write parts of the software requirements, start to evaluate a nodule or portion of that software to make sure that the software is reacting properly to its inputs. This is, I guess, the other way, Eric, is to keep moving forward with the project in phases. And so when we develop those project plans and develop the phases, we want to make sure we go from phase to phase, bringing along the entire project and not just having one portion of the project run so far ahead that we don't have a good measured assessment of how it's working. And that is one of the reasons we want a good measured project plan, to make sure we're bringing everything along. And if something is falling behind, to identify that, to catch it up with the rest of the development and make sure we don't wind up developing, for example, the keyboard before we know what the computer's going to do.
Excellent, thank you. And Elaine, you're so humble. I will actually suggest one other thing, which is to hire someone like yourself, who is an expert in doing this and has seen across hundreds of applications and hundreds of companies things that we may have missed on our own. So that's another really great way to see around those blind spots. But encourage people, if you would, continue to drop questions in the chat, but we will go ahead and jump into the fireside chat portion. So for this, we've developed a case study, and the case study is based around a university researcher that receives a new grant. So here we're talking about a grant likely on the university side. So an R01, R21 type of a grant for developing a new medical device technology or diagnostic technology in their research lab. So first question is, when should they begin to think about these design controls and risks? What types of things can be done at this super early stage? So I guess the assumption here is that it seems like a lot of the things that you talked about would be done much later. when we get ready to commercialize. But are there things that should be done even at this very early stage if we just received the grant and we're starting to do the research?
Well, it's funny, but my reaction to it was that as soon as you've got the grant, because you've presumably filed the grant in order to do something, so you have at least the beginnings of a project plan, I would think, and so your development may be a little d or a big D. I would assume that if your design has or should have had a project plan, that those user requirements at least would have come forward in your mind. You know, why are you doing this? You've probably identified an unmet need or a better way to build a mousetrap. So I think the team should be ready to start to populate some input requirements and definitely the user needs. And so it may be on the back of an envelope, but I think you start perceiving your input requirements and your user needs right now. Now, is it full-blown documentation? Maybe not, but I think you should have some idea of your input requirements now.
Moving forward, question 2 is, as the research progresses, are there any FDA considerations when doing in vitro type testing or animal testing prior to the point where we even get to human?
Yes, one of the things we need to be mindful of is if we're going to have data, particularly from animals, let me say, if we're going to take animal data and submit it to FDA as a part of our future application to the marketplace, or even as support to a human trial, there are regulations, usually known as good laboratory practices, that define not only how we treat that animal, but more importantly, how we manage that data. So one of the things we'd certainly want to do is be looking at a study protocol. What's the objective of the study? What are we actually trying to accomplish? And are we range finding for those input requirements, or are we trying to establish that our device works as intended? So any supporting data that might go forward to an application to FDA or an IDE study for humans, we want to be mindful of those regulations right at that point.
You touch on a point that we see very often with our work at OTC in commercializing devices coming out of UK research, and we start talking to external partners. They're asking for these types of things, and when we talk to medical device companies or we talk to others in the field, they're expecting that some of these things would have been done, and the value of the IP include some of this data. So if we've done it right, you know, with all of our I's dotted and T's crossed, then the value of our IP is much higher than if they have to go back and repeat all of this work. So,
well, and I'll tell you too that there was a situation at UK a few years back where a device was under development and the animal studies had not been conducted under good laboratory practices. So I don't know if it was at the project level or the company level, but there was a warning letter issued by FDA to the project because of their lack of conducting the study under good laboratory practices. So, and there's also USDA rules and all sorts of things. Now, when we're doing an in vitro, cells maybe not so much as full-blown animals, but we do want to make sure we're still following all the rules in terms of sustainability of whatever our test medium may be, that we have controls over that, and that when we say it's so, it can be documented how we know that our results are valid.
Okay, we'll move on to the next phase of our case study. So the research proceeds to the point of testing with human research participants. What FDA considerations should apply at this stage?
Well, definitely we, at this point, would need to know the risk associated with our human testing. It's interesting to know that sometimes you can have a low risk device, but a high risk clinical trial. and so in human research studies, the first thing we want to do is develop that protocol very carefully and start to look with the help of the institutional review board if we can determine this to be a non-significant risk study. And again, that term of art, NSR, has to be confirmed by our IRB and the FDA. If FDA were to consider that you need an investigational device exemption, whereas otherwise the device is low risk, it may mean that your methods in your clinical study are putting the patient at risk. Sometimes we take a fully developed and on the market product that's got FDA clearance and take it back into a human research study, and that provides risk to the patient. If it's a class 2, maybe, or a class 3 product, we ought to be looking for certain at the possibility of filing an investigational device exemption before we start the study. That's known as an IDE. And so if your human research group at your institution believes it is a high-risk study, you can go to FDA and ask their opinion if you believe it is an NSR, or you would have to go to FDA with a full-blown IDE application and have them review the study before you start. And at that point, you're also obligated to FDA to make periodic report as the study proceeds.
All right, we are close to time, and just respecting everyone's schedules, want to stick to our time here. Elaine, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the group as we wrap up?
I guess one thing I would emphasize is just because in the beginning we determine your classification or your exemption doesn't mean that as you go through your program, you haven't maybe made a change or an improvement that alters the level of FDA scrutiny, higher or lower. So as you go through the phases or stages of design control, it's very prudent to reassess against your original documentation. Are you still going in the direction you think you are? And I think that's really important for people to continue to do.
Elaine, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your preparation and your dedication to UK and all that you do, but especially in sharing your time with us today. If you are a UK researcher that has been as a part of this program today, we do want to remind you there's a full group of commercialization managers and team of people with OTC that are here to help you develop your technology. We would love to engage very soon in the process. And as you've heard, the sooner we engage, the sooner we can help with things like this. Elaine is a part of our Mentor in Residence program, which is one of the resources that we have available to be able to support UK researchers. And she can come in and help with some of these things along with our commercialization manager team. So we're very happy to work with you and look forward to working with you on your research. So thank you to Liz, to Elaine, to Jackie, and everybody that was behind this. And thank you all for joining today. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.